Hello, everyone. Dr. Dave Richardson here. I'm your instructor for today's webinar, which is entitled, What is MedDRA and How is it Used? Assisting me today is Sarah Clark, one of the training coordinators with the MSSO. This webinar is scheduled for 2 hours, but as those of you who've attended my webinars in the past will know, I believe in transparency and full disclosure. Given this webinar many times, it will not be 2 hours in length in terms of my presentation of material. There's just not enough material for that to be the case. I would estimate that somewhere between 60 to 75 minutes, although we will leave time at the end for any questions that you will have. I will address all questions that I can, and if we need to refer something to the help desk, we will do so as well. I also want to set the expectation that this is going to be a high-level discussion of MedDRA and a discussion at a very high level of its uses. So if you are sitting on the phone with or on the call with a coding question that you're looking for an answer for, we're not going to address those kinds of things in the Q&A session. There are other webinars that have that as a particular focus, and I want to be respectful to those who've come for a high-level view of MedDRA at this point. The other thing that I need to point out is that this tends to be one of the less interactive webinars. There's not a lot of back and forth in terms of questions and answers, such as in the webinars where we have coding exercises. Because it's informational, it's more of me providing information to you for those of you who are trying to familiarize yourself with MedDRA. Also, the target audience for this is really either individual organizations who are considering implementing MedDRA and want to get some feel for what the product is and what it can do. And sometimes this particular webinar is of value to people in an organization who are somehow involved in the management or supervision of those who actually use MedDRA to try to figure out what it is that these people in their organization are using and to maximize the efficiency within the organization. So I think that's it in terms of full disclosure of where we're going. I'm going to move forward with today's presentation. And again, at the end, we will be available for questions and answers. As Sarah told you in the ramp up to the webinar, you type in your questions to the chat box, and at the end of the webinar, I'll take a look at what's in there. All right, so let's get going with today's webinar. So again, my name is Dave Richardson. I'm a physician by training, specifically an adult neurologist. I'm a medical officer with the MSSO. I have been with the MSSO for over 11 years now, and I am physically based on the East Coast of the United States in Annapolis, Maryland. So this slide is to remind me to tell you that MedDRA was developed by ICH. And because MedDRA is a living and breathing terminology that requires ongoing maintenance, the ICH created something called the MedDRA Maintenance and Support Services Organization, or MSSO. As I said, I'm a consultant for the MSSO, and the activities of the MSSO are overseen by an ICH MedDRA Steering Committee, which is made up of ICH parties, MHRA, Health Canada, and the World Health Organization as an observer. This is a very verbose slide that I'll summarize as follows. The first bullet reminds me to tell you that the material that's being presented is copyrighted material, and also to remind me to tell you that ICH owns the copyright. And with the exception of the MedDRA and ICH logos, excuse me, you can feel free to use this material in public presentations as long as you acknowledge that ICH owns the copyright of this material. However, if you change this presentation in any way, shape, or form, you need to acknowledge that you've made changes, and you should neither imply or infer that ICH supports or endorses any of the changes that you've made. The second bullet is legal language, so I'll read it verbatim. The presentation is provided as is without warranty of any kind. In no event shall the ICH or the authors of the original presentation be liable for any claim, damages, or other liability arising from the use of the presentation. And in this particular webinar, we do not have any third-party slides, so I'm going to skip over that altogether. So let's talk about the things that we are going to discuss during today's webinar. I'm going to give you some background information about MedDRA and its governance. We'll talk about its scope, structure, and characteristics, how MedDRA is maintained. I will describe a couple of the MedDRA tools, specifically the browser and the MVAT tool. We'll also talk about the use of MedDRA for coding data and the principles behind it. I'm going to also introduce you to a suite or group of documents called Points to Consider documents, which are ICH endorsed documents that are designed to help you be a more efficient and effective MedDRA user. I'll then describe something called Standardized MedDRA Queries, which is a tool we provide to you to help you go into MedDRA coded data to try to identify cases of interest for particular clinical conditions. And then we will conclude with our question and answer period. So that's the agenda of what we're going to cover today. So let's begin with MedDRA's background and governance. So what is MedDRA? Well, it stands for the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. Two things I want to point out that are already problematic. The first thing is MedDRA is not an actual dictionary. If you look in MedDRA, you will see thousands and thousands of terms, but you will not find definitions of any of those terms. So you will find the condition Toulouse-Hunt syndrome in MedDRA, but if you do not know what it is, you will have to go to some credible source, an online encyclopedia or some other kind of medical reference to look up those clinical things that you don't understand. And even I, as a neurologist, very often need to use medical references because if I'm looking at some concept related to rheumatology or cardiology, for instance, that's not my area of expertise. The second thing is today, MedDRA is now used for more than just regulatory activities related to the development and approval of products and devices. So in fact, as we continue to do things with MedDRA, like mapping it to other terminologies like SNOMED CT and ICD, we will have other folks involved who may not necessarily be involved in drug or product development per se. And so I just want to be very clear that even though that is what the eponym stands for, we need to be aware that you sometimes need reference materials to help you, as well as to keep in mind that there's a larger scope than just biopharmaceutical development. So let's define MedDRA. It is a clinically validated international medical terminology. So it's a medical terminology used worldwide. The clinical validation aspect of it is very interesting because, in fact, what happens is we have this terminology that we are updating twice a year. And every time we update it by either adding new terms or perhaps changing the placement of terms in MedDRA, we hold our collective breaths because you as the users will come back to us almost immediately and start giving us feedback about things that we haven't done correctly. And actually, that kind of feedback from you is the basis on which we say it's clinically validated, because that is the litmus test as to whether the terminology as we've created it and maintained it meets your needs as our users. So MedDRA is used not only by the biopharmaceutical industry, but also by regulatory authorities which regulate activities. And the terminology can be used throughout the entire regulatory process, from pre-marketing to post-marketing. MedDRA has many different uses, including data entry, which is where you get a narrative or a report from some source and need to decide which concepts are important enough for you to capture in your database. And this data entry, as it is so-called coding, where you will go into MedDRA and find a term that you think captures that. But once you actually put material into your database, MedDRA will also be the mechanism by which you will retrieve that data, evaluate and analyze that data, and present that data, either to internal sources within your organization or maybe outside of your organization in the case of reports that you send to regulatory agencies. So what is MedDRA's purpose? Well, largely, MedDRA allows us to exchange clinical information. Yes, there is some information in MedDRA that is not strictly clinical in nature, but the majority of it is clinically based information. And one of the powers of MedDRA is that no matter what language version of MedDRA you're using, the concepts are the same from one language to another. And so that creates standardization across the platform, regardless of what language is being used. And because each time we come out with a new release of MedDRA, we make that available to all of our users in all the available languages. There is standardization that if you are using the current version of MedDRA at any point in time, you are using the most current version of MedDRA. So MedDRA is an important tool for evaluating products, and that can be a number of different kinds of products. It's important for monitoring, in particular safety monitoring of products, communicating about our products, submitting data electronically, as well as the entire oversight function, a lot of which relates to regulatory oversight of what you are doing, as well as what happens once a drug is on the market in terms of oversight of the ongoing safety of the drug. So MedDRA supports coding, retrieval, and analysis of clinical information. It is not only limited to pharmaceuticals, but also biologics, vaccines, and drug device combination products. So let's talk about the governance. So the ICH MedDRA Steering Committee was appointed by the ICH Assembly to provide oversight of the MSSO. In a sense, as a member of the MSSO, we answer to the steering committee in that they are watching what we do with the idea of keeping the MedDRA product in a role where it is authoritative and helpful to our users. So let's talk about the relationship between the steering committee and the MSSO. ICH owns MedDRA. We talked about that already. The steering committee actually contracts with the MSSO to help with the maintenance of MedDRA. The steering committee also has oversight of all of the operations of the MSSO. They meet regularly with us, they set the yearly subscription rates, and they approve developmental plans and services to be offered by the MSSO. And as I told you earlier, this steering committee is made up of ICH regulatory authorities as well as industry associations. So, just summarizing again, the MSSO is responsible for the maintenance of the terminology. Now, I have the point here that we are custodians, not owners of the terminology. And I always get pushback all the time that, what do you mean you're a custodian? Well, here's an interesting thing. Every 6 months, we update MedDRA. And in each update, we may have somewhere between 1,500 to maybe 2,000 new terms being added to MedDRA. The vast majority of those terms, over 95% of them, come from requests from users like you. You send us in change requests and you tell us, MedDRA doesn't have a term for this, and this is a concept we're seeing with our product. Please consider adding this to MedDRA. So the lion's share of new things that come into MedDRA are because you, as our subscribers, tell us what we need to do to make the product as useful for you as possible. Again, the governance of the MSSO is by the steering committee. But also, remember this, one of the other roles of the MSSO is educational offerings. So we offer a number of webinars like the one that you are attending today, as well as through our website and through emails, sending out communications about the product to let you know what's going on, the latest and greatest things with MedDRA, plans for the future, etc. Now, I also want to mention the JMO, the Japanese Maintenance Organization, which is our partner organization, which is responsible for maintenance of the Japanese language version of MedDRA. So this is an important slide because the question is, where is MedDRA used? And all of these comments are going to be limited to the biopharmaceutical realm, so to speak. So we have this rectangle here, but let's start with what's outside of the rectangle, which is preclinical testing. So these are things that are done to mice and rats and guinea pigs and other animal models that might be of help in understanding a new chemical entity, what its safety profile is, etc. If there are events in preclinical testing that one wants to capture, MedDRA is not designed as a terminology to do that. There are other terminologies, and my preclinical colleagues might have some comments on what will be the most effective ones, but that's not what MedDRA is supposed to do. On the other hand, Once you take this new chemical entity and you decide that you are going to introduce it to humans in clinical trials, MedDRA goes into play. So if we're in phase 1, where we're giving our new drug to a group of healthy volunteers trying to get some idea of the safety profile and maybe a dosing range, or when we move on to phase 2, where we are presumably in placebo-controlled trials treating patients with the condition of interest versus with patients with the condition of interest, some of whom are getting the active product and other are getting placebo, or when we move into phase 3, where we use larger numbers of patients who have the condition of interest. And even then, having compiled all that safety and efficacy data, if we are lucky enough to get approval somewhere in the world for the marketing of our product, MedDRA is still in play because it is an excellent terminology for capturing concepts related to marketed products, and in particular, the clinical safety of a marketed product. If you develop a drug and get approval with only 3,500 patients, you can see that once that drug is on the market and may be exposed to millions and millions of patients, that you need a way of capturing the ever-evolving safety profile, and that's where MedDRA comes in. So where are some specific places you're going to find MedDRA? You're going to find it in industry databases and regulatory databases. It is used in all kinds of safety reports and safety summaries, clinical study reports, the investigator brochure that you create when you are trying to get investigators to work with you on phase 2 and phase 3 trials, marketing applications, publications, the prescribing information, the package insert, the labeling for a product will contain information, a lot of which is coded with MedDRA. And for those of you who live in the United States, you know we have the unique situation here that when you turn on the television at night, sponsors are allowed to have commercials for prescription medicines. And very often they will need to give a list of the most prevalent side effects, and those side effects are going to be MedDRA terms. So MedDRA is used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places in the biopharmaceutical development world. Okay, let's talk now about scope, structure, and characteristics. This is an important slide because many times people will complain to me about what MedDRA doesn't do. And 99 out of 100 times when they complain about what MedDRA doesn't do, it's because MedDRA wasn't designed to do it. So what I think is a valuable exercise is to talk a little bit about what is the intended scope of MedDRA. So we are going to look at things that are within this blue circle, which are things which are within the scope of MedDRA. But let's start first outside of that blue circle, of things that are outside of MedDRA's scope. It is not a drug dictionary. If you want a drug dictionary, I would refer you to Who Drug, which is an excellent product for those purposes. It is also not an equipment, device, or diagnostic product dictionary. MedDRA is going to have very little in terms of demographic terms. It's going to have demographic terms when it adds some clinical value. For instance, there is a MedDRA term for female breast cancer and male breast cancer because everything about those two disorders, the histology, the response to treatment, the clinical presentation might be quite variable. So when it's relevant, particularly for things like identifying vulnerable populations like pregnant women or the elderly or children or neonates, MedDRA is going to have appropriate demographic information, but there isn't going to be a lot of it. We also said that MedDRA is used for things besides drug development. So you're not going to find a lot of clinical trial study terms. You're not going to find double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover terms in MedDRA because, again, not everybody who uses MedDRA is involved in clinical trials. MedDRA doesn't have much in the way of frequency descriptors. MedDRA has a term for headache, but if you care how many times a patient has a headache, you'll have to come up with some other collection mechanism for doing that because that's not what MedDRA is designed to do. It also does not have numerical values for results. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. When you talk about laboratory results, even serum potassium, for instance, two labs in the same neighborhood may have different reference ranges for what's normal. And by the same token, there are certain kinds of lab parameters where we have different scales they can be measured on. We can measure glucose in either millimoles per liter or in milligrams per deciliter. So having quantitative measures is going to be problematic for that reason as well. So MedDRA tends to use qualitative concepts like high, low, normal, abnormal, increase, decrease. Severity descriptors. If you take a case of rheumatoid arthritis and you introduce that patient to 3 different doctors, depending upon their comfort with rheumatoid arthritis, you may get 3 different opinions as to whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. So MedDRA doesn't try to get in that business because it's very subjective. On the other hand, when people make the criticism, MedDRA doesn't help me in tracking the progression of a cancer or of a neurodegenerative disorders, my suggestion to you is to go get a clinically validated score or scale that will do that and use that in conjunction with your other data collection tools because you are looking to have information that MedDRA is not designed to provide. So those are things outside of MedDRA's scope. Let's now pay attention to what's in its scope. Well, medical conditions, disorders, diseases, signs, symptoms, etc. But depending upon regulatory requirements and the coding and use conventions of your organization, MedDRA can also be used to code the indication for use of a drug, various kinds of investigations like imaging studies and lab work, as well as the results of those investigations, various kinds of medical and surgical procedures, as well as medical, social, and family history. Now, those first 5 tend to focus on the patient or subject. The others relate to the drug itself, administration of the drug, or drug-related type, and I'm saying drug, but really the better term would be product because this can apply to drugs, biologic vaccines, and device as well. These tend to focus on the product. So you have everything from medication errors when a product is not being administered properly, product quality issues. You open up a bottle of pills and there are little slivers of metal in the bottom of the bottle. That's a product quality issue that may have something to do with the manufacturing process. MedDRA has hundreds of terms related to devices. Product use issues. This one I like, pharmacogenetic terms. Back in the old days, when you were trying to treat a patient in clinical practice, you would select a drug and put the patient on a starting dose and, as instructed by the prescribing information, increase the dose every few weeks or so, for instance, until you got one of 2 things, that the condition got better or that the patient got an intolerable side effect. But nowadays, we tend to be far more scientific and take advantage of patients' genetic makeup in selecting drugs and also in dosing drugs. So it may be that one of the things you will do before you start treating a patient is make a determination of whether they are a fast or slow CYP3A4 metabolizer. This is one of the cytochrome enzymes in the liver. If you're a fast metabolizer, and that's how that particular drug is metabolized, it may be you want to give that patient 100 milligrams as a starting dose. But if they're a slow metabolizer, you may want to reduce that dose to 50 or 25. So these are important genetic aspects of a patient or subject that impact how a drug might be used, and MedDRA has terms for those. And MedDRA also has terms related to toxicologic issues. And this last one, which we'll talk about briefly, which is embedded in the MedDRA information you're going to receive, are so-called standardized MedDRA queries, or SMQs as we call them. And these are tools that are designed, as I said to you earlier, to help you go into a database of MedDRA coded data to see if there are clinical cases of interest within that database. So MedDRA is a hierarchy, and it is important to understand that MedDRA is a hierarchy with 5 levels. The top level is system organ class. Below that is high-level group terms, high-level terms, preferred terms, and lowest level terms. What you're going to see is as you go down in MedDRA from the first all the way down to the 5th level, we get more granularity, we get more specificity. So you start out with 27 organ classes, but when we get to the HLGT level, it's over 300. And at this HLT level, it's over 1,700. And when we get to the PT level, it is almost 27,000 terms. And finally, approximately 90,000 LLTs. And this is all based on the most recent release of MedDRA, which is version 28.0, which came out on March 1st in English. Excuse me. So a couple of things I want to say about this. The first thing is when you are talking about coding, when you get a report either from a patient or from a doctor or from a pharmacist or from the internet or wherever it is you get a report, what you are trying to do is find an LLT, a term in MedDRA that best captures the concept, best captures the concept that you want to memorialize or place in your database. When people tell me that they couldn't find a term in MedDRA, again, my experience 9 out of 10 times is with 90,000 LLTs in MedDRA, it usually means that they didn't do a very good job of looking. And sometimes the LLT that you want to choose is obvious, but sometimes you need to do a little detective work. So just be aware that when we are talking about coding, we're looking at LLTs. On the other hand, when we go to analyze data, we move up one level. And in my experience, this level, the preferred term level, the PT level, is where most safety data analysis occurs. Now, there's one other thing that I do want to mention. When we are talking about MedDRA in the English language, at the PT level and above, preferred terms, HLTs, HLGTs, and SOCs, MedDRA uses proper British English. Proper British English. However, at the LLT level, it uses both or offers both British English and American English. So in fact, if you are doing any kind of analysis above the PT level and you are accustomed to using American English, you better learn very quickly to add an O to edema and an O to fetal, because you may get no results when you are searching. And it's not because the terms are not in MedDRA, but because you haven't used the correct spelling. So that's an important concept. So let's start at the top with system organ classes. I said to you there are 27 of them, and they are displayed here. This is alphabetically in American English, and we start with blood and lymphatics, and we go all the way down to vascular disorders. And for anybody who has a clinical background, you'll notice that many of these MedDRA SOCs, as we call them, are actually organ systems. So when you are taking a history or examining a patient, you do a cardiac exam, or you might palpate their thyroid gland, examining the endocrine system. You might look in their eyes with an ophthalmoscope. You might look at range of motion in their joints, looking at the musculoskeletal system, or you might check reflexes. These are all things that are related to a clinical examination. But there are, in fact, unique SOCs that are MedDRA owned. And those are things like general disorders and administration site conditions, injury, poisoning, and procedural complications, product issues, social circumstances. So the key thing here is if you want to be a good MedDRA user, you need to have some idea of what's in MedDRA and where to find it in MedDRA. And what you don't want to do is to get tunnel vision where you think that you can use MedDRA in a very narrow way. So for instance, if your company manufactures an antidepressant, you may say, well, the only MedDRA terms I need to know anything about are the ones that are in the SOC for psychiatric disorders. But what happens if your antidepressant causes people to develop an arrhythmia? Or what happens if it causes them to lose their balance by becoming ataxic? Or what happens if it causes some problem with the retina? You would need to know how to go into these other SOCs to find appropriate LLTs for coding purposes. And because, as I said, we add maybe 1,500 new terms every 6 months, MedDRA from a year ago is not what MedDRA looks like today. So every single time I go into MedDRA, I learn something because there's a new term that wasn't in there the last time I looked in a particular place. You will only be as good as your overall knowledge of what's in MedDRA. And I'm not suggesting that you need to have 90,000 terms memorized. but you do need to know that there is a specific sock to look in for ear problems, for instance, and you need to also understand what you're going to find in things like social circumstances. And that all comes from spending time in the terminology. So that's the sock level. So here we have a representation of the 5 levels again. Let's look at one of the SOCs. In this case, we have cardiac disorders. It's one of the 27 SOCs. Now, at the next level, which are the HLGTs, there may be actually 12 different real HLGTs in MedDRA. Now, in the interest of space, we only have room to show you one of them. But if we were talking about cardiac disorders, we might have cardiac disorders related to the valves, or related to the muscle, or related to the pericardial sac. And we also have cardiac disorders related to arrhythmias. So we have cardiac arrhythmias. And below that, we have HLTs. And there's more than one HLT in the actual SOC. But we're looking at one called rate and rhythm disorders not elsewhere classified. If I go down in that HLT, I'm going to find multiple PTs, one of which is going to be arrhythmia. And if I go below that PT to see what LLTs are underneath it, I'm going to see LLTs that are available in that particular SOC as well. Now, if I give you any one of the PTs available in MedDRA, the 27,000 PTs, and I ask you to predict at least one of the LLTs that's going to fall underneath it, it's going to be the PT itself. So you're not surprised when you see arrhythmia as a PT and underneath it as a subconcept, the LLT arrhythmia itself. Here are some others that are in there. Arrhythmia NOS, which stands for not otherwise specified, dysrhythmias. But how about this one? The LLT that is in red, which says other specified cardiac dysrhythmias. This is in red if you look in MedDRA, literally, because we have made, as in the MSSO, we've made a decision at some point in the past to make this term non-current. And we flag it by giving it a red color. Now, why do we do that? We do that because we don't want you to use that LLT anymore. And the reason we don't want you to use it is there may be something wrong with the LLT, or we may have added one or more new LLTs which provide greater specificity and therefore would be a better choice. So the idea of non-currency is very important, that when you are coding, you don't want to use non-current LLTs. So let's talk about non-currency a little bit more. As I said, it's flagged in red at the LLT level in MedDRA. It means that that particular LLT is not recommended for continuous use or continued use. Now, you'll say, well, why don't you just take the LLT out of MedDRA? Well, we never take a term out of MedDRA. Once it goes in, it goes in. We may make it non-current, but it still needs to be there, because if you want to do any kind of retrospective data analysis, you want to look back at your data from 10 years ago, you have to have available to you all the LLTs that could have possibly been used for coding at that time. So, what kind of terrible crime does an LLT have to commit in order for us to make it non-current? Well, it may be that it's derived from other terminologies that don't fit MedDRA rules, and so we make it non-current because it's not consistent with MedDRA rules. It may be that the term is vague, ambiguous, outdated, truncated. It may even have been misspelled when we put it in MedDRA. But of all of these, the one that is most prominent and the one that you'll see happen time and time again is we have a term in MedDRA that becomes clear to us that it's ambiguous. And because of ambiguity, we say, you know what, we can do better. And we make it non-current and try to come up with a more specific term. So the challenge of ambiguity, let me give you a very good example. This works well in the English language. So here are two letters, I and O, standing on the road, and they're looking, and here comes X and L. And I says, if they're Latin, they're consonants. If they're Roman, they're the number 40. And O says, maybe they're from the garment district. The correct interpretation of what XL stands for all depends upon the context. And so, by and large, abbreviations are problematic in MedDRA, because if an abbreviation has multiple interpretations, you can see that you're going to set yourself up for ambiguity. So, I'm going to ask you a coding question. How would you code this? You get a report from a source, let's say from a doctor that said patient had MI. What is the concept that you would want to code here? Now, most of you are going to say MI. And I'd say, okay. And then I would ask you, what does MI stand for so that you know what you're coding? And you'll say myocardial infarction. And you'll be absolutely correct, except when you're wrong and you're wrong. Because there is nothing in this limited verbatim, patient had MI, that tells you that MI stands for myocardial infarction. That's an inference on your part. In fact, even if this report came from a cardiologist, it may not stand for myocardial infarction. It may stand for mitral insufficiency. And if it came from a psychiatrist, it might say it stands for mental illness. And if it came from a vascular surgeon, it might stand for mesenteric ischemia. So you can see why, in fact, terms in MedDRA that have abbreviations in them have been a problem from the point of view of ambiguity. And we tend not to put abbreviations other than in circumstances where there's almost universal agreement that a particular abbreviation only stands for one particular thing. Now, in addition to all the words that are in MedDRA, every one of the MedDRA terms is going to also be assigned an 8-digit numerical code. This code is non-expressive, and what I mean by that is if I give you any one of these 8-digit codes, nothing about the numbers or sequence of numbers tells you whether it's going to be a cardiac term, a respiratory term, an endocrine term, etc. And the reason for that is very simple. Whenever we need to add a new term in MedDRA, we look for the next available number. That's why there's no hidden clues in here at all. But let me tell you one of the advantages of having these codes. Not everyone who deals with MedDRA-coded data is a clinician. They may not understand a medical concept. In fact, if you're dealing with data managers or biostatisticians, they may have no idea what syncope is. But in fact, syncope is going to have an 8-digit code. And if you were interested in finding occurrences of the concept of syncope in your database, you would look up that 8-digit code. You could go to your biostatistician and say, find me all occurrences of this 8-digit code in our database. And therefore, you've gotten someone who knows nothing about what the concept of syncope is to help you because you spoke a language which they understood, which were numerical codes. So keep that in mind and also understand these numerical codes are also an important way for doing electronic submissions. It is another way, another currency to fill in a data field that is being electronically submitted. So an important concept here related to MedDRA. We said that in the 5 levels, we have one level called preferred terms, about 27,000 of them, and these are the medical concepts. Here's an important thing. If I asked you what organ system is affected by HIV, you'd think about it for a second and you'd say, well, it could be multiple systems. So many times there's a medical concept that's not going to fit exclusively in one sock. It may need to be in more than one sock in MedDRA. And that is the case for over 40% of PTs in MedDRA. They appear in more than one sock appropriately. And when that happens, these are called multi-axial terms. So multi-axiality is the representation of a medical concept in multiple socks within MedDRA. Now, we're not going to go into tremendous detail about this, but if I have a term that's in 3 or 4 socks, it is helpful if someone makes the determination when it comes time for data analysis, what is the primary sock, assigning a sock that above all is most likely to be the most revealing in terms of data analysis. So the selection of a primary sock is done by the MSSO. And you can have a term that will appear in general disorders, cardiac disorders, and vascular disorders. And we might, for that particular term, make the determination that its primary sock is cardiac. That helps when you are doing data analysis. If you only look at PTs in the sock, which is the primary sock, you avoid the difficulty at data analysis time of counting the same PT multiple times. So this whole idea of assignment of a primary SOC provides some of the standardization of MedDRA. And it is crucial that because a lot of thought and effort goes into assigning these primary SOCs, that you as the user cannot change the primary SOC assignment. If you do, you have gone against the standardization of MedDRA. And in fact, the tool that you are then using is not MedDRA. And inasmuch as your work may be looked at by regulatory agencies that are using the standardized version of MedDRA, that could be problematic for you. So let's talk about this multi-axiality a little bit more. Here's a PT, obesity cardiomyopathy. When my colleagues who were in charge of terminology maintenance decided to put this in, they put it into two SOCs, metabolism and nutrition disorders, as well as cardiac disorders. And of those two SOCs, the determination was made that cardiac disorders would be the primary SOC. And this SOC, which is related to the metabolic issue of obesity, is going to be a secondary SOC. So there are rules for making this determination, but we're not going to go into any detail in this overview webinar. But certainly if you take any of the coding webinars, you're going to get exposed to the rules for primary SOC determination. Here's another example, influenza. Influenza is found in infections and infestations, as well as respiratory, thoracic, and mediastinal disorders. We've made the determination based on our rules that the primary SOC is going to be infection and infestations, and that makes respiratory, thoracic, and mediastinal disorders a secondary SOC. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this point and ask Sarah, do we have any questions from the audience yet?
Yes, we have just a few. Um, let's see. The first one, it says, in my case, I want to study the major bleeding side effect of drug of interest. If MedDRA doesn't provide a severity description, what would you recommend in this situation?
We will talk about that when we get to SMQs because, in fact, there is a MedDRA query that will help you with finding hemorrhagic events. Other
Perfect.
questions?
Does MedDRA provide support in selecting a preferred term when studying a specific side effect?
We do not, because, in fact, the person or persons most First of all, if you're coding, you're really selecting LLTs, not PTs. Now, we do provide guidance in the points to consider document that I will show you, which will teach you about general principles in deciding what LLTs to use, or even from the point of view of data analysis, if you're analyzing at the PT level, general principles for doing data analysis. But you, as the sponsor of a product, enjoy all of the information to make the right decision of what's the best choice. You understand all the context. You know your drug, you know the package insert, you know what side effects you've seen, you know your regulatory environment, you know how risk averse your organization is, you know about safety issues that regulators are looking for with that particular drug or class of drugs. So you're in the best position to make those determinations. And this comes up all the time of why we don't tell people how to code things. But this was very similar to when I was practicing medicine. If I was walking out of the hospital at night and one of my colleagues who was not a neurologist was walking in and said, "Oh, Dave, I have a question for you. I got a guy upstairs and he's having seizures. What drug should I give him?" I would be silly to give an answer because there's no context of what's going on. Why are they having seizures? What type of seizure? What kind of medical problem do they have? So it's the same kind of situation. I give limited coding advice when it comes to specific recommendations. You're in the best position to determine, either from the point of view of coding or data analysis, what your data is because you know your drug. Other questions?
Yep. Could you please repeat when and at which level I have to use British English and American English?
At the PT level and above, PTs, HLTs, HLGTs, and SOCs, there's going to be use of British English. So let me just very quickly go back to that slide. So if you were trying to look up at an HLT level fetal and you spelled it FETAL, you're going to get no results at all. That's because you are above the PT level. On the other hand, when it comes to hemorrhage at an LLT level, we will have the LLT that is spelled HEM as well as the one spelled HAEM. Okay, other questions?
Yes, one more. It's a combined one. They said, is there a MedDRA code for death? Because my experience is the underlying cause should be listed with death as the outcome, but lots of discussion with other countries on this topic.
Yes, there is a place in the MedDRA browser where we have terms related to death and fatal outcomes. I'm going to write myself a little note that when I open up the browser, I'm going to show you where to find it. You're raising a very important point, which is that death, disability, and hospitalization are outcomes. They are not adverse events, and they typically are not coded as adverse events, except under certain circumstances, and we'll talk about that. Okay, let's get moving so we can kind of be close to our my promised time at least. Okay, MedDRA maintenance. So as I said to you, you have a mechanism by which you can communicate with the MSSO and tell us that you think there's a term that should be in MedDRA, or you can tell us that you think we placed a term in the wrong place, or you can tell us that you think it's in the wrong SOC, or you can tell us things that you believe are incorrect. And the mechanism by which you do this is called a change request. And each organization is allowed to send in 100 change requests per month. These change requests are reviewed by a panel of MSSO physicians. If you request a change or if you request an addition to MedDRA, and it involves a change request at the PT or LLT level, you're going to get a response back from us within 7 to 10 working days. It's going to be one of 4 responses: that we approved your request exactly the way you submitted it, that we approved it, but maybe not exactly the way that you submitted it. For instance, you may have said, I want to add multiple sclerosis to MedDRA, and you capitalize the M in multiple and the S in sclerosis, and MedDRA rules say we only capitalize the first word in a multi-word term. So we would approve it, but we would change the capital S to a small s, and we would say approved, but not as requested. The third scenario is that we would not approve. We would reject your change request, in which case we will give you a detailed explanation for why that was the case. And the fourth scenario is we are suspending a determination because within the 7 to 10 day period, we can't meet our timeline. And it may be that sometimes we need more time to research the topic, or maybe sometimes we have to go back to you for clarification of what you're asking. On the other hand, if you want changes at the HLT, HLGT, or SOC level, these are so-called complex changes. And once a year, we post the complex changes that have been requested to the internet, and we allow you as MedDRA subscribers to look at them and weigh in on, do you think it's a good idea or not? Because these kinds of changes at those 3 high levels have a significant potential to very adversely impact legacy data that have been in sponsored databases for years. So we want to be very careful before we make any changes at that level. But understand that MedDRA has 2 updates a year. There's one in March of every year, which is a so-called complex release, where there could be changes at any of the 5 levels of MedDRA. And then in September, there is a simple release where the changes are limited to PTs and LLTs. So we just released version 28.0 on March 1st in English, and on September 1st, we will release version 28.1, which will only contain changes at the PT and LLT level. So the tool that you use for submitting these change requests is called WebCR. It is a tool that you will find at this URL. It's also accessible from the MedDRA website. Your request must be in English. You can propose new terms. You can propose changes to standardized MedDRA queries. You can even send requests because you believe that our translation of MedDRA into another language, that something was not done correctly, and make suggestions for more specific or better translations. This tool has a very user-friendly interface. It's going to immediately confirm when it has received your request. You also have the ability to export requests that you've submitted for review, and you have the ability to look at the change request history going back to MedDRA version 5.1, because you may want to go back and see that somebody put in the exact same change request a year ago and we rejected it, and see why it was rejected. And you will be able then to look at that and say, oh yeah, I see why they rejected it. And then you save yourself the effort of submitting a CR because you believe that it was appropriately rejected in the past. So that's what this interface looks like. You need a MedDRA ID and change request password. You submit your request related to either terms or S&Q changes. It is helpful for you to put down as much information as possible. The more information that you put down, the more likely it is that your change might be implemented. If you put down, I suggest that you add this new term to MedDRA because I just came back from the 11th annual Congress of Hepatology, and there is a new disease that's not yet reflected in MedDRA, and here's a reference. That's very likely to be something that's going to be approved because you've taken the time to write a very careful justification. On the other hand, if you say, I want you to add this term to MedDRA because I like it, that's probably not going to fly. And I say that facetiously, but you'd be surprised how many times we get requests to simply read, this term is not in MedDRA, when in fact the reason it's not in MedDRA is because it doesn't belong in MedDRA. So give us good justifications to work off of, and we are very thoughtful in looking at these things. And here's what the interface looks like. Here's a person who wanted to submit a request for a new LLT. The more documentation that you put in, the better chances of implementation. Now, I'll just talk about this one very briefly, which is the proactive maintenance process. This is a little bit different. This is where, rather than focusing on one LLT or one PT, you come across the fact that there seems to be an inconsistency across the platform where we're not doing things the same, let's say, in all 27 SOCs. Let me give you an example. You can have a situation where you look at the PT level in one SOC and you see the hemorrhage concept at the PT level, and all the hematoma concepts are at the LLT level. But now you go into another SOC and you see the exact opposite, where the hematomas are at the PT level and the hemorrhages are at the LLT level. This is one of those situations where at some point we wavered from a consistent approach. And you point that out not to point out just one place. It's a problem where we're not systematically doing the same thing. It's the same situation here. You contact us, this time through the help desk, and you say, can you take a look at this? I think there's a problem with how you're, for instance, here's some examples, how you're handling bruises and contusions. It's not consistent. Now, these kinds of proactive maintenance requests can be very complex. So we don't say that we're going to respond back in a certain number of days. We'll take the time to look at it critically. But if you come across these issues, please let us know, because we don't get many of these proactive maintenance requests, but when we did get them, they were very, very well thought out. And I would say somewhere between 70 to 80% of the time, they were actually implemented. So it's not like you're wasting your time. We actually do listen to you about these recommendations. So let's talk about MedDRA tools, what you get with your subscription. Well, first of all, you get a browser. What is a browser? Well, when you get a MedDRA subscription, every time there's a new release, we give you a bunch of flat files. And the way to think about flat files is it's information that is on pieces of paper. They're not really on pieces of paper. In this case, it's on Excel spreadsheets. But something needs to reconstruct the MedDRA hierarchy, meaning taking the HLTs and putting them under the appropriate HLGTs and putting the correct LLTs under PTs. And this is what the browser was designed to do, because not everyone in the audience works for a company that has a multi-million-dollar data management system. So in point of fact, what happens sometimes is that you will end up with no ability to know what the hierarchy would look like unless you can reconstruct it, and that's what the browser does for you. So we have multiple versions of the browser: a desktop browser, we have a web-based browser, we have the legacy version that's not available, and as of December, we released a new browser with a less complex or simplified interface. So eventually the plan is to phase out the legacy web-based browser in favor of the new one, which has the cleaner interface, and Also, the plan is to take the desktop browser and change its interface so it is a lot less busy and easier to use. And there is also a MedDRA mobile browser, because at some point in the past, someone told us that you need to have access to MedDRA on the beach when you're on vacation. So we created this, but facetiously, I don't think that it gets used as much as anybody thought it was going to be used. Okay, so every one of the browsers requires a MedDRA ID and password. It allows you to search the MedDRA hierarchy as well as to standardize MedDRA queries. It supports all available MedDRA languages. The interface can be changed to other languages so you can work in a language you're more facile with. And on the desktop browser and web-based browser, you have the ability to export search results to a research bin or to a local file system. Now, there are a few things that are unique about the desktop and web-based browser and some subtle differences. Both of them allow you to see not only the primary SOC allocation, but also secondary SOC allocations. They allow you to upload properly formatted data and run them against the existing standardized MedDRA queries to see if you have cases of interest within the data you've uploaded. They have advanced search features, Boolean search features, and at least in the web-based browser, we also have a dynamic ability to change the view of the browser so that you are actually able to see changes that have been approved for the next version of MedDRA but are not yet in MedDRA. So we are currently in version 28.0, but our international medical officers are already approving changes for 28.1. And if you go into the browser and you look in this so-called supplemental view, you're able to see those new changes that are going to be available in 28.1. And this might be for the purposes of planning, recoding that you need to do, etc. So just want to show you very quickly. Here's the interface of the new web-based browser. This is the legacy. So you can see this is the new one, the legacy. The new one is crisper. It has all the same information, except they are layered in pages behind this, and you don't have this much busyness on the main page. And this is the desktop browser, which eventually will have its interface updated as well. Another tool I want to tell you about is the MedDRA Version Analysis Tool, or MVAT as we call it. Here is the URL. It's free for all MedDRA subscribers. It is a nice tool in that it allows you to do several things. We'll start at the bottom here. It allows you to take any term that exists in MedDRA, type it into the MVAT, and see the entire history of that term in MedDRA. When was it introduced? Was it moved around? Was its level in MedDRA changed at all? The second thing it allows you to do is to take any two versions of MedDRA and compare them. So you could take version 28.0 and compare it to version 26.0 and see all the changes that occurred in that 2-year period. Now, for those of you in biopharmaceutical development, that's not a practical term or practical tool in the sense that you'll say, well, wait a minute, I can't go 2 years between updating my data in my database. But not everyone who uses MedDRA, as I said, is involved in drug development. So it may be that a researcher writing a paper doesn't have to use the latest version of MedDRA and may want to cut off or use exclusively an older version of MedDRA because they're just trying to create data that supports a theme. And then the last part is very, very impactful is you can actually take properly coded data or properly formatted data, load it into MVAT, and see how the changes that have occurred in any two versions of MedDRA will impact your data. So you can see by loading this thing up into the MVAT that you have 20 rows of terms in your current database that need to be updated based upon changes that have occurred in MedDRA. So this MVAT demonstration, you will definitely see if you take one of the data analysis webinars that we offer, and it's a good tool to know about. Again, this interface can also be changed as well as the output. We also have the ability to see secondary SOC assignments in the MVAT tool as well. And this is what MVAT looks like. We have the basic MedDRA SOCs here, the versions that are being compared. And this is what the legacy and that tool looks like as well. So, coding with MedDRA. Coding conventions. What are coding conventions? Here you are, you're an organization and you want to have certain rules for how you code and why you code and what you do when you code. So coding conventions are written guides and sets of principles for using MedDRA. And the whole point of having written guidance is for you to be consistent. So if you hire new coders and you hand them your coding conventions, as long as they are following the conventions, every coder should be doing the same thing. Hopefully they understand enough about coding that they are selecting the right codes, in which case you also are going to ensure accuracy. So one of the things that coding conventions allows us to do is to harmonize the exchange of MedDRA coded data. And many organizations will add additional things to their coding conventions beyond just the selection of terms, including what do we do when we get something that's misspelled or an abbreviation or an acronym? What do we do about due to concepts? What if we get fever due to the flu? Sometimes you will decide that you have rules that you want to put in place. In a trial, you'll say, every time we get a report of chest pain, we want you to query back and make sure that it was cardiac in nature. So why do we even need coding conventions? Well, because the number of people who are coding is large and they have varying degrees of medical aptitude. Some are physicians, some are nurses and PAs, some have a bachelor's degree in history and somehow fell into a coding job that's been very limited in terms of the number of products. And they do very well at it because they've been doing the same thing for 20 years' time. So we need coding conventions because we want to have consistency. And because MedDRA is so robust, it gives you a lot of choices and you want to make sure that you're doing things appropriately. And in fact, even if you have an autoencoder, a piece of software that's trying to text mine and tell you what the LLTs are, sometimes your autoencoder will tell you, gee, I can't figure that one out. You're going to need to code this one yourself. You need conventions that will tell you how you do manual coding when you do it. So the points to consider document. ICH has endorsed several documents which are so-called points to consider documents, and one of them is called the MedDRA Term Selection Points to Consider document, or PTC as we call it. This document specifically is designed to give you guidance on how do you decide what LLTs to use when you are coding. So this is what the document looks like. You can find it on the MedDRA website. And it is designed to give recommendations and guidance to make sure that your coding is at least accurate or at least consistent and hopefully accurate. This document is used not only by industry, but also by regulatory agencies as well in terms of making decisions about coded data. And the group that is responsible for developing this document has regulatory members on it. So if you decide that you don't want to use this document, just understand that there may be regulators who you are providing reports, et cetera, to who have had a stake in developing what they consider to be the proper way to go about coding. So this PTC document is developed by a working group of the ICH Steering Committee. It's updated in March of each year. There are complete versions of this document in English, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Spanish, and Russian. And there are condensed versions of the same PTC document in the languages shown here. And these documents are found not only on the MedDRA website, but on the Japanese Maintenance Organization website. So an important thing then when it comes to coding, what you are trying to do when you are coding is find an LLT. And you want to only look at LLTs that are current. You do not want LLTs that are non-current for coding purposes. And you're always going to try to select an LLT which most accurately reflects the reported verbatim data. So if we had a report of abscess on face, and you went into MedDRA and you said, oh, gee, here's an LLT for abscess. I'm going to code this as abscess. You've been a little bit lazy because, as I said to you, there's 90,000 LLTs. And what you've done by just using abscess is you've given up the anatomic location, because you could have an abscess on the face, but you could also have it on the skin and in the brain and in the lung. And if you had done a little more investigating, you would have found out there's actually an LLT for facial abscess. So that's what I mean when I say go ahead and look, because you may find something that's more specific. Because if you put a non-specific or weak LLT into your database today, there's no way of correcting it 2 or 3 years from now when it's time for data aggregate analysis. And again, make sure that you only use current LLTs. So the key to quality data is accurate coding. And sometimes that means rather than taking the simple but wrong answer and falling off the cliff, like plenty of lazy people who say, I never spend more than 15 seconds coding a case, sometimes it's going to be complex. You need to do a little bit of research. The road is long and winding, but because it's a complex situation, all you're really trying to do is make sure you get it right. So you're selecting terms for all reported information. I was raised in the pharmaceutical industry where we selected terms for all AEs, regardless of causal association. But we also had coding conventions for coding device-related things, product quality issues, medication errors, various kinds of histories, investigations, as well as the indication for use of a drug. So what does this translate into in terms of actual real life situations? You get a report of throbbing above the temple, aching all over the head, pulsing pain in the head, real bad headache. What concept might you want to select out of available terms that capture these kinds of verbatims? It could be headache. If we get infection in lungs, there's a MedDRA term for lung infection. How about this one where a patient took drug A instead of drug B and experienced hypertension? Two things happened here. One, the wrong drug was administered, so that's one LLT, and there was a clinical consequence, hypertension. And that points to consider document for term selection is going to take you through all these various scenarios and talk to you about what you should do in trying to arrive at the best possible LLT choice. So I'm showing you these two slides just to show you the index of what's in the term selection LLT. I don't expect you to memorize what's in the document, but here's what's important to know. I think at some level you need to know, for instance, that there is a section in the term selection PTC on exposures during pregnancy and breastfeeding. Maybe once a year, you're going to get a case that comes across your desk about a child, a baby that was exposed to your drug through breast milk. And all I want you to remember is that guy, Dave Richardson, said that I should know there's something in the PTC about breastfeeding. So you can open it up and read for that one time each year that you need to understand what is the proper way to capture a case where it's related to breastfeeding. And other kinds of things as well, which are covered in our coding courses like congenital terms. How do you deal with suicide and self-harm? Very important to get these kind of things like suicide and self-harm correctly, because you may have a drug that has a significant number of suicides in a given year, or you may have a drug where you never see them. And when there's a suicide in someone who's taking your drug, you need to be very sure that you are coding it correctly. So just familiarize yourself with what's in here. And just for thoroughness, I'm going to tell you that there are other PTC documents as well, not only the one for term selection, but there's also one for data retrieval and presentation. This one deals with the fact that you have properly entered data into your data set, and now you want to figure out how to pull it up for analysis, for presentation, for evaluation purposes. So each of these two, the term selection as well as the data retrieval, come in complete versions as well as in condensed versions. And we also have another PTC document called the companion document. And this one has as its genesis the fact that we had complaints from users that some concepts were not covered in enough detail. So it has several sections, including a section on data quality, an extensive section on medication errors. It has a section on product quality issues. And recently we added a section on manufacturing and quality system issues. So if you need to know more about any of those particular topics, and the one that I think you should make sure you have a good understanding of is medication errors, because regulatory agencies are always trying to get you to be on the lookout for those, because sometimes if you're having a significant number of medication errors, there are some corrections that need to be made, maybe to your labeling, your packaging, or something of that nature. So I'm going to just very quickly, let's see if my browser is still open. Yes, nope, it timed out. So let me just log in again. So here is the browser. And I'm going to spend just 5 minutes showing you this. Again, why do we have a browser? We have a browser to benefit our subscribers who don't have a data management platform that reconstructs the hierarchy of MedDRA. So when you look at this, I want you to think of this as having 3 sections: the left section, the center section, the middle section. So the first thing you will notice is that when I open this thing up, it has a display of the SOCs in English in alphabetical order. It starts with blood and lymphatics. It goes all the way down to vascular disorders. Also notice that I have the option of looking at the MedDRA hierarchy in multiple languages. I can look at up to 3 languages at one time if I wanted to. So let's see, if I were to change this to Chinese, you're now seeing English over Chinese. And you can have 3 languages displayed that way. So let me switch that back to English. Now, the second thing is it's telling me that I'm in version 28.0, but I could go back all these versions if that's what I wanted to, because I'm in the web-based, so it's dynamic and live. If I were to take any one of the SOCs and start opening it, when I get to the SOC level, let's say I did cardiac. If I open up cardiac, look at what I see. I see all of these HLGTs that are underneath it. If I were to select any one of those HLGTs, I'm going to see all the HLTs that are under it. And if I were to select any one of the HLTs, I'm going to see PTs. And if I were to select any one of the PTs, I'm going to see LLTs. Now, I know there are those who are going to ask me, what's the difference between a red box and a blue box and a green box? Legitimate questions, but not in the scope of what we're going to do today. That would be covered in greater detail in one of the coding webinars. We certainly have instructional videos as well on the browser and its makeup on our learning management system as well. And every single one of these versions or versions of the browser will have a user guide as well. But that's to just show you that we have the SOCs represented here. Now, the middle section here is where you can actually do searching. So let's say I was interested in coding a case that said the 16-year-old had a headache, and I wanted to code that to the term headache, but I wanted to be sure that the term headache actually exists in MedDRA. If I type in headache and search, I'm going to get results. And the results are going to tell me, yes, there's an LLT in MedDRA called headache. That's an exact match for the concept of headache. So that's going to tell me I can use LLT for coding purposes. It's also going to tell me that there are 94 other terms in MedDRA where the word headache appears. So I would select an appropriate headache term based upon what I was told. If the report said 16-year-old had a post-traumatic headache, then I would choose this LLT over the more general headache because a higher level of specificity. And in fact, I want you to pay attention to this one right here, where LLT is in red with a red box. And as I said, when you see an LLT in red, it means that that term, in this case, headache discomfort, has been made non-current, and you shouldn't use it for coding purposes. Similarly, if I have a concern as to whether this LLT that I'm thinking about is really the medical concept that I'm thinking about, I can highlight it and I can ask to go to the browser. And when it goes to the browser, it's going to actually show me where headache is in the MedDRA hierarchy. So now I feel very comfortable that it's under the PT headache and it's under the HLT headaches not elsewhere classified, and it's in the nervous system SOC. Another way of doing searches as well is if you think you're pretty good with MedDRA and you know where to look in the hierarchy, you can actually do a top-down search. So suppose I wanted to see if MedDRA has a term for myocardial infarction. Well, the first thing I would have to guess is what SOC is myocardial infarction going to be in? I'll select cardiac disorders. I would then need to know that it is not a myocardial disorder. is actually a coronary artery disorder. And then I would need to know that it's an ischemic disorder. And eventually I would get to a PT called myocardial infarction. And I would find that there is an LLT called myocardial infarction. And I could then confirm I can use myocardial infarction. And just for interest's sake, look here and see that we have our friend LLT MI red, because MI could mean myocardial infarction or mental illness. So again, a demonstration of that. So this was a top-down search. The other one that I showed you was a bottom-up where we look for headache. Anytime I select a term in MedDRA and ask for details, I get a pop-up box that's going to give me more detail about that particular term, and that same information is replicated here. And then this last thing here is a filtering tool, and let me tell you how you would use that. Let's say I was interested in coding ear pain, and I select the term pain, and I search. It tells me that there is an LLT called pain. Now, what I said to you earlier is if I coded to pain, I'm doing myself a disservice because this was ear pain. So now there are 669 other terms in MedDRA where the word pain appears. You may say, gee, I don't really feel like looking through 669 terms. So what I would do in that case, which would be very smart, is to say, you know what? I don't want you anymore to look through all 27 SOCs. I only want you to look in ear and labyrinth disorders. And now I run the search again. And now it tells me, here are your choices of LLTs that have the word pain in them in that particular SOC. And here's ear pain right at the top. So now, rather than having to look through 669 terms, I only had to look through 7. And look at this big box that's warning me, saying, dude, you put a filter on. Unless I clear that filter, the rest of the day when I'm using MedDRA, it's only going to be looking in that particular SOC. So this is just a quick attempt to show you what the browser looks like. We have all kinds of training materials, and it's discussed in further detail in the courses, other courses or webinars. So let's finish up by talking about standardized MedDRA queries. So you have just finished creating a database with MedDRA coded data, and you're interested in finding out if certain kinds of problems are occurring in your patients that you may not have recognized because the diagnosis, for instance, was not explicitly stated in the report. So standardized MedDRA queries take terms from one or more of the MedDRA SOCs. These can be signs and symptoms, diagnoses, physical findings, lab findings, etc. And they're all designed to try and identify a case of interest. So these SMQs, as they are called, are constructed at the PT level. So if I want to create, let's say for argument's sake, an SMQ for multiple sclerosis again, clearly I'm a neurologist, so I stay in my ballpark. What I would do is go into MedDRA and try and find all of the PTs that represent concepts that might be related somehow to multiple sclerosis, like imaging issues, like symptoms that might be involved, like therapies that might be involved, etc. And I would add those PTs to my standardized MedDRA query. And by definition, all of the LLTs that are subordinate to those PTs would be included as well. So these standardized MedDRA queries are comprised of PTs and their subordinate LLTs. And what happens is I take this standardized MedDRA query and I run it against a database. It doesn't matter whether it is my clinical trial database, my safety database, and every time one of my LLTs is represented in my database, this tool tells me hit, as in you got something that you need to look at. And that means that someone needs to look at that case and figure out whether it's actually a case of multiple sclerosis that may not have been called multiple sclerosis. So what SMQs are really designed to do is you've got a database with 10,000 cases in it, and you run the multiple sclerosis SMQ, the mythical one that I created, and it now tells you these 57 cases could be MS. And that's telling me that now I need to look at those 57 cases in more detail. Now you'll say, but that's a lot of work. Looking at 57 cases is a lot easier than looking at 10,000 cases. And that's what queries are designed to do. So Showing you this as well because there's a lot of information on these SMQs in one of the other PTC documents that I mentioned. The data retrieval and presentation has a lot of information on SMQs in it. But here's what I want you to appreciate about SMQs. We have 110 of them available at the current time. What I want you to appreciate when we look at this sample is we try to select appropriate topics for SMQs. Important, serious, life-threatening conditions. Things like agranulocytosis, convulsions, hypersensitivity, things like shock, serious cutaneous adverse reactions like Stevens-Johnson syndrome. We try to select those things that you need to be sure are not associated with your drug, either because they are going to stop your drug from getting approved, or they might get your drug pulled from the market because they're serious enough, especially if you do a risk-benefit analysis. Suppose your drug is for bad breath. Once you get up to about 10 cases of convulsion on your drug for bad breath, don't be surprised if someone says the risk-benefit is not worth it and you have problems with either getting that drug on the market or keeping it on the market. So this is why you should know about SMQs. They are high-ticket, high serious, high lethality issues that you want to be aware of when you are evaluating your product. So their benefits, they can be applied across multiple therapeutic areas. They have a validated search logic. They are standardized in that the SMQs are going to contain the same terms, whatever version of MedDRA you are looking at, whatever language version. The results are going to be consistent. If you run an SMQ against the same database, you're going to get the same result over again. And here's the best thing about them. Somebody else already maintains them. We created them and we update them and we maintain them at the MSSO on an ongoing basis, along with help from the JMO. What are our limitations? They don't cover all possible medical topics or safety issues. Again, nobody cares about a SMQ for nail fungus. It's not going to stop your drug from getting on the market or pull it from the market unless the risk benefit would suggest. And the other limitation is when we put these out, like anything, it's a work in progress. We test them, we put them out, we think they're pretty good. But the test of time will be you using the SMQs and giving us feedback as to how well it works. And maybe there will be some need for refinement in the future. So where we use these things, because this is what you care about. I mean, at this point, it's an abstract concept. Why do you care about SMQs? Well, if you're on the clinical trial side in any phase of development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, SMQs can be very helpful in helping you to define the safety profile of your product when it's not well established. You can use it as a screening tool. What if you are developing the 7th drug in a class that has a very well determined class effect? Or what if you have some data from preclinical work that suggests that something may happen in humans? You can use selected SMQs to help you monitor for that topic of interest. And certainly on the post-marketing side, they're invaluable. Because as I said, you may have gotten your drug approved with 3,500 patients. Now you're out in the real world where millions of people are taking your drug. And you don't have the restrictions that you had in clinical trials, where women of childbearing potential couldn't be in there, or people who abuse drugs couldn't be in there. In the real world, people are going to be taking your drug while smoking marijuana and wash it down with vodka. And that is the true test of when are things going to start to happen with your drug that you couldn't have known about because the number of exposures was very low and you put so many restrictions, it's artificial with what actually happens in the world. So in the post-marketing arena, you can use it to retrieve cases for suspected or known safety issues. SMQs should definitely be part of your signal detection strategy, along with other things like proportionality ratios and literature review, etc. You can use it for single case reports, and you can also use it for periodic reporting, the safety reports that you periodically need to submit. We have an SMQ that is entitled lack of efficacy, lack of effect. You may have a section in there where you need to address lack of efficacy. And that's a good starting point in terms of an SMQ that you might want to start with. So to summarize what we did, we talked about background information with MedDRA, its scope, structure, and characteristics, the maintenance of MedDRA. We talked about the browser and MVAT tools, coding, general principles of coding, and the PTC documents, and we finished with the SMQs. For those of you who want to know more, I think there are a number of different avenues. You can, for instance, take the webinars that we have related to coding, the advanced or basic coding webinars. You can, if you want to know more about data retrieval, we have a data analysis and query building webinar, as well as one on SMQs. Excuse me. We also have a learning management system in place that has a number of modules to help you with some of these topics. We have video casts on our website that can show you or give you information on things like how do we assign primary SOC allocation, all these various things in terms of using it. And of course, certainly a live face-to-face course is most valuable because in that 8-hour course, the interaction and exercises are extensive and you're going to learn a whole lot. So I want to open up something in response to an earlier question that I had, and this was about death. So in general, the rule is death, hospitalization, and disability are outcomes. They are not adverse events, and you normally would not be coding them. But the exception would be when you get a report where it is the only information in the report. So you get a report that says patient was found dead. That's the entire report. Patient was found dead. You need to code death in that circumstance as an adverse event. Now, I'm going to tell you a true story. My first day in the industry, I walk into my brand new office as a medical monitor. The office is completely empty with the exception of a manila folder on my desk. And the folder had a death report. I'm brand new to industry. I know nothing about death reports. I didn't know anything about expedited reporting requirements, and I didn't even know where to look to find ways of expressing that. And this was back in 1980, I'm going to say 88, 89, where MedDRA didn't even exist. We had HUART and COSTAR. Well, it is important for you to know in those circumstances where you need to code death that you go to general disorders and administration site conditions. And when you do that, you're going to find an HLGT called fatal outcomes. And then it's going to have only one HLT, death, and even more ominous, sudden death. And you're going to open that up and you're going to find a PT called death. Now, first of all, let's look at the other PTs that are in here. Brain death, clinical death, drowning, electrocution, hanging, stillbirth. I mean, there are a number of mechanisms, concepts related to death in MedDRA. But if I go under death itself and scroll down, I'm going to eventually find an LLT that says found dead. And as you recall, the verbatim that I gave you was patient was found dead. So in that particular case, you would code the LLT found dead as an adverse event and immediately go back and find out what happened as quickly as possible. It will not be acceptable for you to just code that. And when a regulator calls you or contacts you 2 weeks later to ask about the death, you say, oh, we didn't look into it. Now, I'm not in industry on a daily basis anymore, but I don't think that's changed. When you talk about fatal outcomes, you need to do exhaustive work to try to understand all the circumstances and whether your product may or may not have been involved. So I wanted to show that to the person who was asking about that earlier, because that is an important teaching point. And then this is the MedDRA website, which I think you should be familiar with, meddra.org, where you can find everything, including this link here for support documentation. And when I go to support documentation, that's going to take me to, got a little glitch here. It's not, all right. Maybe I'll try it again and see if I can get this to do what it's supposed to do. Gotta love the internet. Also helps if you spell correctly. Let's try it again. Yeah, I go to support documentation page and I'm going to find things there like these PTC documents here. There's also a document for best practices. I'm also going to find guides to the general use of MedDRA and the use of SMQs. There's plenty of stuff there. There are things related to the training. There are things related to the tools available, like the browser, like the MVAT tool, and the new mapping initiatives that we are undertaking with MedDRA as well. So, and then other things here as well. So I did the webinar a little differently today in that I broke at certain points and asked for questions, because normally I do all the questions at the end, but I thought with this one, because it's an overview, we are better off asking or trying to answer the questions as they come up so that you're not confused about something and not able to appreciate the rest of what's being presented. So at this point, I'll go back to my slides. This is contact information. Here's our website. This is the email for the help desk. Frequently asked questions available on the website, and most importantly, we actually have the answers there. And these are the links for the various, versions of the browser. And then continuing, how you submit a change request, the training schedule, which you obviously were familiar with because you signed up for today's webinar, and the support documentation page. So I'm going to stop at this point and thank you for your time and attention, and ask Sarah, what do I have in terms of questions at this point?
We did get one about 10 minutes ago when you were showing the browser, and it said, do we always have to code in the LLT?
So when I say coding, that is synonymous with data entry, and most, in fact, I can't name a company that I've ever been affiliated with that does not code at the LLT level, because that's the highest level of granularity and specificity. When you are doing data analysis, on the other hand, in my experience, people do their data analysis at the PT level. Any other questions?
That was it for right now. I don't know if any will come in the next couple seconds, but otherwise, no.
You've been a wonderful audience listening to me ramble for 90 minutes. I hope I've taught you a lot about MedDRA and gave you a general overview. Based on what we've talked about today, if you have things that you want to know more about, again, I've talked with you about all the various training options and initiatives. You get to be a better MedDRA user the more you use MedDRA. My own personal opinion, when I get someone in a course who's never done anything with MedDRA before, I tell them you need to be using MedDRA on almost a daily basis for probably a year and a half before you get to a point of real comfort. So when I have people show up and they tell me that their boss sent them to be a coder because the next day they're going to be head of coding, I just kind of shake my head, because that's just not realistic. It's a big terminology, it's a complex terminology, and even if you have a limited number of products in your portfolio, you really need to know what's under the other rocks as well, because your drug may cause you to have to look in a sock that you didn't anticipate having to look in. Anything else come in at the last minute?
Oh, yes, just right now. It says, let's see, what is the relationship of MedDRA and Who Drug?
We have a collaborative relationship with them, in the sense that sometimes when we are doing MedDRA user groups, they do their user group at the same time. And so that way, our users are served by being in a location and being able to get training on MedDRA as well as Who Drug. Who Drug is a drug dictionary. So it is a totally different product than MedDRA, but necessary from the point of view of coding things related to the drug itself. So it'd be very difficult for you to say, I only want to know about MedDRA unless you are in a very specific part of your organization that only is involved with that, because in the development of drugs and information that needs to be submitted, you need to use both terminologies. Anything else?
That was it.
All right, folks, thank you for your time and attention today. I want to thank Sarah for her help. And this is Dr. Dave Richardson signing off for today.